So thank you all in the audience who've joined us. We're very excited to have you, and I'd love to welcome you to the inaugural Coffee Chat with an Expert, a series by ICOMOS USA and ICOMOS Canada to share perspectives from movers and shakers doing cutting-edge work in our field. My name is Anasha Srinivasan. I will be the moderator. I sit on the ICOMOS USA Emerging Professionals Committee, and I otherwise serve as a cultural property protection analyst at the U.S. Department of State. I am thrilled to welcome and introduce our expert today, Dr. Jonathan Bell. Jonathan has over 20 years of global expertise collaborating with national and local governments to develop conservation and management strategies for cultural heritage sites and infrastructure around the world. He is currently the Vice President of Programs at the World Monuments Fund, wherein he curates and oversees World Monuments Fund's portfolio of international projects, ensures professional standards, and develops innovative strategies that support local communities. The WMF has partnered with local partners to safeguard more than 700 sites in 112 countries since 1965, using a people-first approach that honors the connection between communities and their surroundings. Jonathan has previously held leadership positions in such institutions as the National Geographic Society and the Getty Conservation Institute, spearheading initiatives to protect historic sites and build sustainable management strategies. He serves as an expert member on multiple ICOMOS scientific committees and sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Architectural Conservation. Jonathan holds degrees from Harvard, the Sorbonne, Columbia, and UCLA, blending his international background in anthropology, art history, urban planning, and historic preservation. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to speak with you, and we'd love to get to know you, your work, and any advice you can give to emerging professionals here today.
Well, thank you so much, Anasha, for that beautiful introduction. I feel like you said it all. I have nothing left to say, but I'm
I
delighted
don't
to be
believe that
here.
for a moment.
Delighted to be here with all of you.
Wonderful. So I think we can just get started. I'd love to hear just what inspired you to join this space and what would you describe as your ethos and your work ethic?
That's a great question. So I'll start with an anecdote about what really introduced me to this crazy field of cultural heritage and moved me to join. I was actually, I started my career as an art historian and was still a student. I was a master's degree student at the Sorbonne, which you mentioned, focused on Tibetan Buddhist iconography.
Hmm.
And I was invited to a monastery in far western China, in the Tibetan cultural region. That was about 5 hours on horseback to get to,
Wow.
working with a team of Italian wall painting conservators. And part of the reason I was invited is that this had been an ongoing project for a number of years, doing conservation on the wall paintings, but no one had ever looked at this 300 square meters of incredible wall paintings.
Mm.
And so it was a wonderful opportunity as an art historian to be the first to publish on this incredible
Oh,
collection of paintings. But what really moved me was, as I said, very rural place, 5 hours by horseback to get there. And when I was on the last trip, so we're actually finishing the conservation project, and when we finished and unveiled the work, and I should say we, really the conservators, not me, um, people came from all over on foot, miles and miles away, and had tears in their eyes to see these beautiful wall paintings that they had so cherished, kind of, brought back to their original luster. And I thought, this is what I want to do. This is something that impacts people, it affects people's lives, and a field I want to be in. In terms of ethos, I think that first introduction in many ways informs my ethos and my approach. It really, for me, conservation, cultural heritage work, historic preservation, whatever we call it, is about people. It's about the legacy of communities, the way that we as a species express ourselves and leave our mark on the planet. And so it really is about the people whose heritage we're working with. And so it's important to involve communities in everything we do. And that's what I have always strived to do.
that's wonderful to hear. And thank you for sharing that anecdote. I mean, I imagine there's nothing really more moving than seeing the impact of, what is otherwise an academic study, something that is very technical, but tangibly seeing the way it emotionally connects to people is just one of the most powerful things. One of the most powerful elements of our field in the space is we get to do that.
Absolutely. And I think sadly, sometimes we lose touch with that. We lose sight of that
Mm,
because we are so focused on either technical challenges or maybe policy challenges and get caught up in kind of the paperwork and the physical work. But it ultimately we have to stand back and realize that how what we do impacts people. And it's not only the communities who may live in and around this, a heritage site and call this heritage theirs, but it's also the tourists and the researchers and everybody
mhm,
else who was
mhm.
introduced to the rich, rich collection of heritage places around the world.
Absolutely. It really is an ecosystem. And then, just because the work is so vast, I think we tend to focus very much on our corner of the ecosystem and then just forget that there's a whole other climate out there,
It's
in
it's
a
really
manner of speaking.
true. No, it's really true. It's really true. And I think the planners and policymakers amongst us are often dealing with communities and community members and hearing their thoughts and expectations. But some of the more technical folks and even management specialists, sometimes lose sight of that. But that's actually one of the things I love about the field is that it is such an interdisciplinary field.
100%.
We really can't do anything with one specialization, one specialist, one expert. It really takes a whole team, a number of different perspectives, and a
Hmm.
lot of different experience to come to sound solutions and strategies.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's wonderful that unlike many other fields, this field seems like one that wherever you come from, you can still find a space here, right? No matter what your background is.
No, that's a really good way to put it. I love thinking of it that way. It is kind of a home for everyone, because everyone does have a role and a perspective to share, and often an expertise to share. And I may jump into one of the questions you're thinking of asking me, but I often think about this. I often tell students and young professionals that while it is this multidisciplinary field, it is really important to get some area of specialization to really kind of carve out your specialty and your expertise so that you really do have that voice and you can come in with that perspective as well as all the other experience that you bring with you.
Mhm.
And that's why there is, as you say, a kind of a home for everyone, which is really lovely.
Yeah. Well, since you're getting ahead of me with the questions,
Sorry.
no, no, no. I want this to be a dialogue, I want this to be a conversation. I do want to pause really quickly for those who are in the audience. Please feel free to share any questions you have for Jonathan in the Q&A box or in the chat. And as we see them, we will absolutely incorporate them and ensure that Jonathan can speak to your questions. So please feel free at any moment. But, speaking of areas of specialization and expertise, I'd love to transition a little bit into talking about your work. And you just have such a rich background, such a rich experience in this space. And I'm really curious, not just about your current position and the World Monuments Fund, but, also what experiences have you felt really key to getting you where you are? And not just experiences, but also, skills, um, connections, like, how did you get to where you are today?
Great question. And it's funny. I think some of my friends, let's say, and family laugh at me because I have kind of skipped throughout life, put in a lot of work, but there have been these moments like the one I mentioned earlier that have been these turning points. And then I said, hey, now I want to go in this new
Mm,
direction. So that was the first one that introduced me to the field. And then dutifully, I was living in France at the time, dutifully came back to the United States, and went to a program, historic preservation program at Columbia University here in New York, where I am now. And then, very luckily got a position right out of that program working with the Getty Conservation Institute. And the next kind of moment I'm going to mention was towards the end of my tenure with the Getty, which was about 8 years. Um, we were working in Egypt, in Luxor, on the West Bank, another World Heritage Site,
Mhm.
working in the Valley of the Queens specifically.
Wonderful.
And this was a moment, there's this area called Gordona, which has been, was a home for a number of the folks and descendants of folks who started working with the earliest archaeologists
Oh, wow.
on the West Bank, this Theban necropolis, right? And so they were their homes, which were really colorful and often earthen, were a key part of the landscape. And this hill that is part of the Theban Mount. And there was a move to relocate them, unfortunately,
Mm.
quite forcibly. And I was there at a moment when literally there were bulldozers next to houses, and as soon as the house was empty, if somebody would go out and leave, they would just knock the house down.
Mm.
And that for me was a moment where I thought it reminded me again that the field is about people. I loved my time at the Getty. The Getty Conservation Institute is a wonderful, wonderful organization, an institution, but our focus was so much on the technical aspects.
Mhm.
And even though we were there and trying to do what we could and raise awareness, it wasn't really our role or our place or our wheelhouse, to be quite
Mhm.
honest.
Mhm.
And I thought I need to get the tools to really raise awareness about these things
Mm.
and affect policy in this regard. And so that was what then kind of pushed me to get a PhD in urban planning, and that's when I went to UCLA. And that gave me the skill set to really work with people, a social science approach, and understand how do you measure what people are thinking? How do you take the
Mm.
temperature of a kind of communal expectation or even appreciation of things? And then I'll just mention one other thing. From there, I finished my PhD. I wasn't quite ready to leave Los Angeles, where I had been for, about 13 years at that point. And I took up a position with the County of Los Angeles in something that will surprise you, flood control and water resource management. And so I worked there for 4 years, working a lot with community members and a building full of civil engineers. But I
Mm.
learned a lot about water and the value of water. And I brought that into what I do today. Here at World Monuments Fund, we have started a number of projects that are focused on historic, sometimes very ancient water management systems and rehabilitating them because they're often quite valid and can still work and
Mm.
help us address challenges of water insecurity. So all of this to say, there have been these moments that I've said, "Ooh, let me make a right turn here." But I've tried to kind of pull it all together and say, well, what have I learned and what can I bring to the next thing I'm doing?
That's wonderful. It's so, I think it's really great that you have, taken a look at not just what is the track in the space, but what are the key, what are the key ways I want to grow? What kind of skills, what kind of professional do I want to be? And what are opportunities that can give that to me? And then taking the risk of trying something out and learning a new space and then bringing it back to our field. And it sounds like it's really enriched your work and the work of the World Monuments Fund. And, it's really, I think that's really a wonderful perspective and set of experiences to have to bring you to where you are.
Well, thank you. It's been really rewarding, and it didn't always seem like it made sense.
Oh, of
I was
course.
in the middle of it, we
You
all
build the
get
narrative in retrospect. Yeah.
right, exactly. We all get a little bit confused, a little bit lost, and wonder if we're in the right place at the right moment. But it has really helped me. Now, one other thing I'll say about particularly my time in government is that it gave me a wonderful appreciation for what government is, how complex it is. And yes, that sometimes the wheels do turn very slowly, but that there are wonderful people in government doing great work. And it just
Absolutely.
helped me to understand the challenges, but also how to work with government
Mhm.
systems. And I think probably many of us have had that experience, if we're not ourselves, within governmental institutions.
Absolutely. It's such a critical part of the ecosystem and just ensuring that policy is not something that is written about or talked about, but actually put into effect and has some teeth behind it. And it's such a valuable experience to have. Um, you talked a bit about some of the challenges that you've experienced in your in the way in ways you've seen our field has interacted with communities and people. Can you speak to some of the challenges you have faced now that you're in your current position working with programs and communities?
Sure. I mean, in terms of challenges in the field, they're endless. Again, as I said, this field is about people, and people are wonderful, but they're also challenging. We all know we can be difficult, and often communities and groups of people are standing up for what they believe in, which is very
Hmm.
important. And
Hmm.
so it's really important to be able to listen and respond thoughtfully and then integrate some of those perspectives into solutions that we're trying to develop. And so honestly, that process is always challenging. But just to give you some of the day-to-day and quite honestly, some of the mundane things that I think a lot of
Please,
people never think
please.
about in terms of challenges. There are a lot of things that we deal with that end up becoming big issues just because we can't
Mm,
find an immediate solution. So, for instance, we've been working in Iraq for a number of years, have a few active projects there, all quite sizable. And recently, it's been very difficult to get money into Iraq.
mm,
And
mhm,
that means obviously the work can't continue. So how do you address some of those problems, find new ways if the old banking systems are not working, how do you address that and find kind of workarounds that are also obviously legal and reliable and all of that. Um, Additionally, we're often struggling with capacity. There are
mm,
some places we work where there is incredible capacity and professionalism in the field, and quite honestly, those projects are often a lot easier, at least for us.
mhm,
We really work as kind of project managers extraordinaire and come in and help put everything together from soup to nuts in terms of project development and implementation and even follow up and evaluation. And so where we have partners on the ground who really have great capacity, that's easy.
mm,
Often this is not, or sometimes I should say, this is not the case. In some areas of the world we work, really preservation is a burgeoning field or even something that's just not been heard of. And
mhm,
so challenges there are building up our local partners to be able just to even understand what we're talking about and what types of things we want to understand from them. And then, of course, making sure they can acquire some skills along the way.
mhm.
And that takes time and patience. It's very worthwhile, extremely rewarding, but it's challenging, to be honest.
Yeah, time and patience, and you know, to always be showing the value of what you're doing, even when the fruit of the labor is not really going to be seen until maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road.
Absolutely, exactly. And that can be really hard. Again, it goes back to working with governments. Many people who are entrenched within government, of course, I think do have the long-term vision, but politicians tend to have a shorter term vision because they know they're in a certain role for a certain number of years, want to get things done, and then are looking for their next position. And so, cultivating the political support is
Mhm.
key. It can be challenging. Again, it can be quite successful and rewarding, but it also has a time limit and an expiration date, unfortunately. And then you have to start again when that new person or
Absolutely.
that new regime comes into power. And that's another challenge that we face.
That's great. That's also a challenge that I feel very intimately in my line of work. I can relate to that. Um,
Absolutely.
we're just getting a few questions in the chat. I'd love to just share them with you
Sure.
before we maybe dig a little deeper into the work that you do with the World Monuments Fund, and just I'd love to ask you a few questions about technology. But I think the first question we have here is, what kind of skills as an aspiring heritage professional should I be looking to obtain in order to be successful in finding a job in this field?
Yes, a great question. And I'll go back to something I said. Well, let me start first by saying I think there are, key key tenets and approaches and kind of theoretical basis to the field that's really important for anyone to to really be able to capture and internalize and understand. And so I think that's the benefit of going through some sort of heritage program,
Hmm.
whatever that may be. But I'll go back to what I said earlier, that I think to really make one's, I guess, carve out one's place in this world of heritage, it is important to develop a set of skills that are really useful and meaningful, and create your own expertise. Make sure that you have methodologies and approaches that have a basis and that you
Hmm.
can apply to the field. And so that way you can come in, as we said, this is an interdisciplinary field. Every team has a number of people on it from very different backgrounds. So if your interest is in structural engineering, get the skills you need to really understand that and be able to address it. If it's in visitor management, then likewise, get those skills, get that experience, and be able to come in and speak about what has worked in other places and what could work on your current project. And I think that makes one very marketable, but it also is it's very fulfilling.
Could I push you to just in your role with your team, with the people you engage with in the projects, uh, could I ask you to give maybe a few examples of individuals or positions that you have found to be really valuable to your work, and what sort of soft skills, hard skills are good for those positions? And of course, not speaking to the entire field, but just give you a few ex illustrative examples.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind is this is actually a position we recently created and filled just about a year ago. And this is an evaluation role. And I think all of us will know, and I think particularly perhaps the younger people are talking a lot more about evaluation, the importance of monitoring, evaluation, and learning in our field, which quite honestly, as a field, we've been rather late to
Mm,
adopt. And I think it's really essential. And not only are funders asking more and more about this, it really does improve on the work that we do. It allows us to look back and see if we've actually had the impact that we intended to have
mhm,
at the
mhm.
outset of a project, and understand what's worked and what hasn't worked so that we can really improve on how we approach these things. And I think, key skills there, obviously, critical thinking, being very analytical, but there is also, and I think most positions in this field, there's a key role of kind of negotiations and diplomacy, because
Mm,
often you are introducing concepts and even specific methodologies that are very new to a lot of people.
mhm,
And it's funny, but I'm sure we've all been here. We all feel threatened by new things, and so it's really important to be able to highlight why these things are valuable, show specific cases and case studies of the outputs and why those things are meaningful for what we do, and do that in a non-threatening way. So I always highlight as a soft skill this diplomacy and being able to communicate with a number of different audiences. There are a lot of people in the field and a lot of people I work with whom I adore and respect, but really know how to talk very well to other colleagues. And when it
mm,
comes to a broader audience, broader public, or even politicians, policymakers, and so forth, miss the mark because they don't know how to get out of the tech speak and the lingo
right.
and
Yeah.
talk more broadly about what we're doing and what we want to accomplish. So broad communication skills, diplomacy, I think are just key soft skills in everything. And in terms of these roles, this evaluation role is really important. I'd also highlight, some of the basic things of what we do. You need people who can do good documentation. That's
Mm,
essential to everything that we do, and who can keep up on the technology that is behind and continuing to shape and expand the types of tools that we use for documentation. One other tool I'll mention, which is perhaps not so soft, but it's just organization. In my role, I oversee all of the project work that we do around the world, and so that ranges anywhere from 60 to 80 active projects in about 40 some countries at any given moment. And so being organized, being able to understand where data are for different projects is essential, and having a team that buys into that organization and
mm.
follows it is really essential.
And that it feels like goes back to your communication piece of, being able to not just communicate outwardly, but, also take a team and be able to rally them around an idea, and ensure that everyone is staying organized. I
Absolutely.
I love that you highlight. Oh, please go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to mention one other thing because
Please, please.
again, in my world in particular, but I think across the world of heritage, one of the things that I always hear and have myself experienced is the real challenge is funding. Uh,
Mm,
we don't have enough money to do what we need to do. Doesn't matter whom you work with, what
absolutely.
role you play in this sector. It's the reality. And so I think especially if you are in a nonprofit or in an entity that is poised to raise funds, another key part of the team is that development person, that a fundraising person, or really a whole team to guide through the process of cultivating new donors, whether they
Mhm.
be individual philanthropists or foundations and even government entities. All those of us who filled out proposals and applications for government funding, we know how tedious that can be and how detailed.
Oh, yes.
And you need someone who has that skill set and those patience. So just another key team member.
No, that's wonderful. And I think I'm really glad that you highlighted that piece of it, that there's a technical aspect of getting really good at the conservation science, but then you need to be able to ensure that it is funded and,
Absolutely.
just developing relationships. There seems to be like a common theme with all the soft skills that you've had highlighting here. And I'm really glad that you mentioned, broad communication, not just that you can speak to your colleagues, but that identifying that speaking with, policymakers or community stakeholders or, civil engineers, as the case might be, or it's all a different language, and, demonstrating that you can do that very accurately is wonderful.
Yeah,
We're
and
getting, oh, please.
if I could just say one more thing
Of
about
course, of course.
because one of the things, and it took me a long time to figure out how to articulate this, but one of the things I've been focused on, particularly in this role at the World Monuments Fund, is how do we communicate that heritage places, this broad definition of what it is relevant to our lives today. And I think
Mm,
that's something that, again, the field has not always been very successful with.
mhm,
I think if we look at the kind of natural conservation world, environmental conservation, they've
mhm.
been a bit more successful, a bit better at getting this
Absolutely.
public message out and getting people to understand why this is meaningful and why it impacts my life wherever I may be. So I think that's something that we need as a field to really embrace and think about how can we show policymakers, individuals, donors, and so forth, and the communities we work with that why heritage is relevant, how it
Mm,
can impact our lives, whether we're talking about recovery after conflict or some other dramatic event, or bringing revenue into a community through some sort of sensitive and controlled tourism, right? That heritage has a role to play in all of this.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I just want to we're getting quite a few chat questions in the chat now. I think you're inspiring a lot of people in the audience. Um, so the next question we have here is that you've mentioned that this field of work is for people, about people. Where do you see the borders between people's needs and heritage conservation for conservation's sake?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
I think it's always a negotiation. Um, from
Mm,
our approach here at World Monuments Fund, one of the key tenets that we hold is that we are not working on our own heritage, and this is yes, all
mm,
kind of heritage of at a universal sense of all humanity, but we don't own these places, and we can't call the shots. And so I think there are times when community or group expectations have changed, have evolved, and particularly when it's clear that there is still this connection and this appreciation and value that is placed on a site. But there's a recognition that we need to update it for what we need today. And I don't think we should shy away from that. We should do all the hard work to understand what the
mm,
imputed values are, what all the aspects of significance are, and ensure that we are making decisions based on those and
mm.
trying to protect and promote those. But there's no sadder place than a place that is unused. And this is why many places become abandoned. And then need our love and care because they're falling apart, right? Whereas a place that's used does receive that care and receives that continued um, protection and cultivation in a way. And so it's a negotiation, but we should always highlight what the values are and do our best to articulate those and make sure that local communities are on board with how they're articulated,
Mm.
and then find that middle ground so that we can make sure the place continues to have a life after our project.
That's great. Thank you. And I think it's the point that you made that it's not necessarily our heritage, but we, seeing ourselves as truly as stewards, but then of course
Exactly.
prioritizing the values of those who actually live there. And at the end of the day, if that, however that negotiation happens, or whether or not we agree with it, that's not our final call.
Right,
I
right.
appreciate that. Just want to get through a few more of these. We're getting a lot. Um, so someone is asking, they are looking at the importance of international partnerships. How integral is international collaboration in meeting project objectives globally, which is a question I imagine you encounter very often in your line of work.
And yes, very much. Uh, Collaboration is key. And often when I'm talking about World Alignment's Fund and the work we do, I say over and over again, I'm sure I've said it already, partners. And we can't do anything we do without partners, and particularly local partners. But we do have a lot of international collaborations. We have worked quite extensively with ICOMOS on a number of different efforts, including in the past on our Watch program, which is kind of our
Mhm.
flagship biannual program that highlights places around the world. We work with other entities and organizations that are either professional or research institutions related to heritage. And of course, whenever we're working in a place, we have to work with those local and national government entities and professionals on the ground. The other thing that I'll say, I mentioned earlier that some of the places we work just don't have that local capacity
Mm.
to address the challenges we see in the way they need to be addressed. And so in those cases, we will bring expertise from outside, where we commit to bringing the expertise that's needed. We always look first locally, because we want to empower and employ, and also if we can upskill. But when we can't find exactly what we need locally, then we're bringing in international partners and professionals. So there's always some aspect of international collaboration in everything we're doing. And I would dare say, even when we're working, we are an American organization officially, even when we're working in the US, just because we are such an international organization. So there are always international perspectives and experience that are coming even to bear on our work in the US. So it's always there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just a quick follow-up question on that. Being an American organization that's based in the US, and your work is extremely global and also domestic as well. You do quite a few projects in the United States. Uh, have you found instances when having an American perspective, or just, our set of laws, our guidelines, our policies are very specific to this country, as it is with any country that, one is working from. How are you able to negotiate between, our perspective and the perspective of a project that you're working overseas, and, communicating what those differences are? Like, how do you manage that negotiation?
It requires translation and
Mm,
interpretation. And I'm very lucky because I have a large team who are all over the world. And so, we are broken up somewhat regionally. And so
mm,
I always have someone who's overseeing a project in their region who knows that region, who
mm,
understands the cultural context, often speaks local language, and can really be that arbitrator, as it were. And sometimes, the arbitrator to me and to us here at headquarters, saying, that's not going to work, that's not going to
mm.
be acceptable in this context. And so therefore, what we need to do is this. And that's really essential. I think we all, no matter where we're from and where we're working, we have to always remember that we bring perspectives and experience with us. I think they're often quite valuable, but they can be very biased as well. And so that's where it's really important to have someone who can help guide us through local context.
Mm. Thank you. I think that actually segues quite nicely into the next question we have here. Um, what do you think that the contribution of emerging professionals around the world can bring to the efforts of conservation and protection of heritage, especially within the 2025 World Monuments Watch? And then following that, what roles and opportunities would you suggest to the emerging professionals within that framework? And I was very tickled to see that the moon entered the 2025 watch list. Um,
Sure.
I'd love to defer that to you.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for mentioning the moon. I think it's a little bit it's gotten a lot of excitement
I bet.
and press coverage that many of you may have seen. I think for some people it's also a little bit contentious. You know, are we
Mm,
just grandstanding here, or is there something really to be considered? And we strongly feel that there is something to be considered. Um, you know, are we going to be flying to the moon and setting up projects there? No. But we can promote and talk about some of the big issues that are related to this kind of second age of the space race, as it
mm,
were.
mhm.
Um, so yeah, to answer your question, well, so I think emerging professionals are an incredible group because one, I'll just say you, I think I'm talking to many of you, you all bring, you know, many new perspectives. I see myself getting older every day and seeing that I don't understand not only some of the new technology and approaches in ways that I would love to, but there's new thinking about how we approach heritage and how we approach the challenges that we face on the ground. And I think all of that is really valuable and pushes the field forward. I like to think that when I was in my 20s and 30s and really starting out, I was doing some of that myself. So it's a really essential role to play. In terms of the watch specifically, that's a really interesting question. Um, Maybe let me say a few words about how we work and how we kind of
Yes.
launch a watch and get started. I hope many of you know, and I hope many of you will have been involved. And if not, I encourage you in the next cycle to submit nominations, as we call them, for watch sites. It's open to any individual, any institution or organization or government anywhere in the world. And so I think that's a key role to play. It takes a little bit of time to put a nomination together, but it's kind of a relatively easy lift, but one that can have a lot of impact, particularly if your site gets chosen and put on the watch. So that's the first way to get involved.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of our next steps with this current 2025 watch, despite our name of World Monuments Fund, we do not have buckets of money sitting around. I wish we did. And so we have to go out and fundraise for
Mm,
every project that we put together. So the sites get on the watch, and now my team is spending a lot of time figuring out what are the best possible approaches to making a difference, to having impact in each of these sites, working with the local partners. So we begin to put project proposals together and then try to get those funded. So if any of you have some funds to put to this, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. But I think in a more practical way, you know, there could be ways that if any of you have specific expertise with any of the sites that are on the current watch, you know, do reach out. We'd love your perspective. Maybe there's even an opportunity for you to be involved in a project. Um, we're always happy to hear from people who can provide information, share perspective. That's very helpful to all of the work we do. But I'd say, you know, the best way and perhaps the most impactful way is really to send in nominations for places that you think deserve attention, deserve this kind of promotion and protection. And I like to always say the watch is not just about problems, it's also about opportunities.
mm,
Sometimes a place can really be enhanced because the right government is in place or there are new funding opportunities, and that can have a lot of value. It's not only addressing problems and challenges and threats.
mhm. Great. Just a few sort of nuts and bolts follow-up to that. Is there guidance on the website for how to submit nominations? Is that something that that emerging professionals can find and look at through the website?
Absolutely. So since we have just announced our 2025 watch. That was back just a month ago. Seems much longer. We don't have anything on the website yet for the next cycle. The next cycle will be the 2027 cycle. However, what that means is that the call will go live likely early next year, basically a year
Mhm.
from now. And so at that time, and even a little bit before, we will have all the guidelines, all the information on the website, and be sending that out through our networks as well of how can one nominate, what's required, and also some kind of hints and key pointers of how to have a successful nomination.
Thank you. And so everyone, we have a year to go and submit sites for nomination. And in terms of, if one has specific expertise, is there a place to reach out, say on the website or to you, or how would you recommend the best way to do that is?
Great question. Yes, I think I'm trying to think what website, what emails are on our website. But you can definitely reach out to me. I'll just share it here. It's jbell@wmf.org. It's not a very complicated email. So please do feel free to reach out, and I may send you to some of my colleagues who are working in those specific areas. But yes, we'd love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing your information. Appreciate
Yeah, of
that.
course.
We've got three more questions, and then I just want to cap it since we're about 15 minutes out from the end. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order, but uh, coming off of what you said about how EPs, emerging professionals, can advocate for new forms of thinking, new ideas, new confluences. Have you come across any challenges working intergenerationally? And do you have any advice on working intergenerationally and that kind of collaboration? And I think also following up on that, um, how are ways, from your perspective, that, young emerging professionals who have maybe new ideas can advocate for themselves?
No, that's a fantastic question. My first observation, I guess, in terms of challenges or where there's more translation sometimes needed between the generations,
Mhm.
has to do with ideal expectations and sometimes very brutal realities.
Mm,
And I think that emerging professionals have a role to play to remind us about the ideal and to keep striving for the ideal. But I think those of us who are a bit longer in the tooth and have a bit of experience working on the ground know that there are often concessions that have to be made, and there's a lot of negotiation to really
mm,
get to a successful outcome. And sometimes that means taking the theory and making it fit to the
mhm,
current context. So I think sometimes that's the biggest challenge. I see that a lot in terms of how that how that relates to donors and fundraising,
mm.
for instance. Uh,
Sure.
Often, particularly when we talk about individual donors, high net worth donors who can fund an entire project and are incredibly generous and a key part of our field, but they have specific expectations.
Mhm,
And it's definitely our job to shape those and educate them. But sometimes we have to make some concessions to put in some signage that has their name on it, for instance,
mhm,
making sure
mhm,
that signage is not horribly intrusive, right? That's kind of our shape. And so we have to do things like that. And I do see often with emerging professionals, it's like that is kind of against the book. And it's like, well, there's not just one book, and we have to remember that. What I would say in terms of how to advocate, I think it is, I think, I think it's helpful to maybe ask, to question why things are, as opposed to saying, well, this is against this, or this
mm,
is, what we know should happen, but ask, why was it a certain decision made? And can I kind of be let in, be shown behind the curtain
mm,
to understand how we got to that point? Because again, I think that really helps in kind of the maturity of the professional, understanding the realities of the field. But then holding your ground. If you've been
mm.
hired somewhere, if you're part of a project, it's because people want to hear what you have to say. So don't be afraid to say it, but just make sure to package it in a constructive way.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that. I think that is something to remember as an emerging professional to uh, you know, not have to shut down certain ideas of yours, but think about how can I communicate this broadly to, multiple audiences and with their considerations and their challenges in mind, so that this is the most effective way to communicate what I feel is right or what I feel is important. That's a
Absolutely.
great way to put it. Thank you.
It's all about negotiations, back to
It's
those
all
soft skills,
negotiations, it's
right?
all communications. It's
Absolutely.
what everything is. Um, this is the next question here is something that I had written down also later on in my question list. I'm glad it's coming up. But talking a bit about tech, and specifically, I just want to segue these two questions. Can you, one, speak to what tech is you find important to your work now, what tech you feel is going to be important to the work down the road, and then specifically to this question, how has World Monuments Fund, how have you dealt with AI within the organization and sort of keeping up with AI's role in documentation, in conservation? Um, I mean, and this is not part of the question, but also rights of artisans
Yeah.
and artists and how do you do that negotiation? So I know it's a three-part question, but
Okay, well, let me start with tech
sure.
generally. I mean, we use all sorts of tech. We employ all sorts of tech from things in the lab. We don't have our own labs, but of course we're working with partners and consultants to do materials analysis and all of that work. And I always, having a bit of a technical background in the field, I always kind of put a plug for that because I feel like when we say tech, everybody starts talking documentation, and that's a key part of it. I'll come to
Mm,
that. But we have to remember that, to make decisions about interventions and to design really appropriate and successful physical interventions, we often need to understand building materials and understand the challenges they're facing. And that means lab work. And that there's a lot of high tech, very, very high tech equipment behind all of that.
mhm,
But of course, also in monitoring, environmental monitoring, in documentation, we are using everything from simple photography and line drawings to drone documentation and lidar and 3D scanning and everything in between. I'll use that as an example to bring up some of the AI, where we're often working with partners who employ AI in the 3D modeling that they're
mm,
doing. So we all know the great point cloud that is created after you do a laser scan, and suddenly you have these millions of data points that you have to figure out what to do with. And now, a lot of the world is using AI to put those things together. There's another approach of the old school photogrammetry, but taking 100,000 photos in one go and then having AI stitch
mm,
those images together to create models and photogrammetric views of places. So I think AI is already a part of our work. That said, we have been having a lot of conversations here at World Minds Fund about the future of AI, what it means for what we do, and where we should be employing it, and where
mm,
perhaps we should take a breath and understand a bit more. I can't say we've cracked that nut or we've solved it, but we definitely have put some policies in place and are much more thoughtful about where AI is employed and how we also control some of the data, to make sure that it's not going out into the broader
mm,
world if there are things that are, to your point, artist rights, copyright, even personal information of
mhm,
donors, of consultants, of our own team that can get caught up and suddenly become, be out there in the ether, as it were.
mhm,
So I think there are a lot of challenges, but I do think AI has already proven itself as a really useful tool for us, and I'm sure we'll be using it more and more. I can't even begin to imagine how. One thing I'll say, just because we haven't spoken about it, I think it's really important, is climate change.
oh, thank
It's
you
a
for bringing it up.
challenge.
I didn't think we'd have time, but thank you for bringing it up.
Just had to throw it in there.
Yes.
Climate change is a huge challenge for all of us. It's a challenge for every heritage place in the world. Um, and I think us understanding the implications and the impacts that we're seeing of climate change, I think AI is going to play a key role
Mm.
in that, particularly in the stochastic modeling of
Mhm.
what's to come. How are rainfall patterns going to change in a specific place? How will the relative humidity change? Those sorts of things that we know impact the places that we're working on.
Mhm.
And the flip side of that, that I always have to say, I touched on it earlier with the water infrastructure example, is that heritage also has a role to play in helping us adapt to climate change. And so things like historic water infrastructure are a great example, but there are many other things, historic building technology, traditional knowledge that have already adapted to local climate. And that climate may move and change, but we're going to find it in other places. And I think we have many lessons to learn from traditional approaches. And some of us may be the best place to really implement those sorts of traditional approaches in new places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that is a really growing dialogue that we're
Yeah,
having in this space. And, as much as we can engage with it and share and um, advocate for new ideas and perspectives for as emerging professionals, it's such an important space. So thank you for bringing that up. I wasn't sure if we would have time, so appreciate doing that.
I had to get it in there.
I appreciate that. I know we're about 4 minutes from the end. I want to thank everyone for uh, sharing your questions and being a part of this. I know there was about one question or so that we didn't quite get to. Um, and I don't know if we have time, if I can just quickly share that question, if you can give me like
Sure.
one or two sentences on this. But for your international projects, can you just give a sort of rundown of roles and specialties that usually fill a project team?
Yes. So on our team, on our kind of projects will be run by one of my teams, a project manager, and then on that technical project team, if we're working on a building, for instance, we'll usually have a conservation architect, we'll have a contractor, and of course, all the labor that's required. We may have a documentation specialist if there are structural issues, structural engineer. If we're working at an archaeological site, obviously an archaeologist. So it is a very multidisciplinary team, and usually each of those people comes with their own teams in tow. So some of our project teams can be quite large, but very multidisciplinary.
Right. And going back to your point on, finding your voice and carving your niche and speaking broadly to a bunch of different types of stakeholders and project members, but knowing your thing very well. Um, Jonathan, I could ask you questions all day. I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been an absolute pleasure. There's been such a rich discussion, so many great takeaways. And so, on behalf of all of the attendees and ICOMOS USA and ICOMOS Canada, thank you so much for giving your time and for sharing your perspectives with us.
Well, thank you so much, Nasha. It's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to talking to many of you again.
Yes, please. And so Jonathan has shared his contact information very kindly. Um, I assume that means that if one wants to reach out to him,
Please
feel free
do.
to do so. And once again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.